I'm pleased to introduce to you tonight Ruben Ulises Rodriguez Montoya, who is here with us from Mexico City. He was born in Parral, Chihuahua, New Mexico. He was raised in an immigrant community on the U.S.-Mexico border of El Paso, Juarez, and New Mexico. He will discuss with us this evening his current solo exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art San Diego, titled In the Garden of Earthly Delights, I Bend to Paradise, and it's on view till May 24th. Ruben positions himself as a multidisciplinary artist, myth maker, whose work centers around anthologies and social issues concerning border culture, abjection, adaptation, and mystica. He draws on Mesoamerican cosmology, viewing his sculptures as fantastic beings, nuales, shapeshifters that oscillate between human and animal states. He writes, "They exist and live alongside me and my family's cosmology. Nuales share my awe of the desert, but have also inhaled the lethal landfill fumes that caused the premature death of my sister inside my mother's womb. What if the insidious fumes of landfilled waste were to distort the genetic composition of Nuales?" And then later he writes, "Becoming chupacabras, monsters born from the collective fears of Latinx communities, a mythological genesis from toxicity, but also a result of assimilation and neoliberal agendas that led to NAFTA, forced migration, land exploitation, poverty, and gendered violence." End quote. In the past 2 weeks, we have seen on the media and heard in the news of yet another ecological disaster resulting from U.S. capitalist hubris in the bombings of Iran. I can't help but wonder about how Persian shapeshifters, the jinn, spirit beings made of smokeless fire, and the ghoul, the symbol of humanity's struggle against unforgiving landscapes, will mirror these Latinx communities, and how these various impacts of capitalism and colonization efforts might begin to further create these monster spirits being born of toxicity. Ruben Ulises Rodriguez Montoya has an MFA in sculpture and extended media from Virginia Commonwealth University, a BA in Spanish from New Mexico State University, a BA in Multidisciplinary Studies from University of Texas in El Paso. Solo shows include Mocha Cleveland, representing Murmur's Gallery at the Material Art Fair in Mexico City, Sargent's Gallery, both in 2020 and 2022 in New York City, Murmur's Gallery in Los Angeles. Selected group shows at Tucson Museum of Art, Murmur's Gallery LA, LA Triennial 2024, Ballroom Marfa in Marfa, Texas, Museo Anahulcali in Coyoacan, Mexico, Mana Negra, Guadalajara 90210, Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. Gabelli Gallery, Los Angeles, Palm Springs Museum of Art, Mocha Tucson, Company Gallery, New York City, Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia Beach, and Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles, California. We are so pleased to have Ruben with us here. Please help me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you so much for being here, all of you, and thanks for extending your space out to me. And it's been a pleasure to sort of get to be in the studio so far. I don't know about tomorrow and how I'll feel about that. But everybody so far has been really motivating, and it's been really nice to see the kind of conviction that you all have about your practice and about how you're committed to what you're doing. So I just want to thank you for sharing that with me and allowing me to like see your work. Again, yeah, thank you for allowing me to be here. So this show that I just opened at ICA San Diego was 3 years in the making. And it basically is that because of everything that's going on in the world. But first, I just want to acknowledge that like it's my practice, but there's so many people that are involved with it. So this is my ex-partner that made this poster, and my parents also have been like really supportive in terms of helping me sew when they see me that I'm out late night, like sewing. So just know that like what you see as a commitment to my practice, not only for myself, but also from people that care and support what I do. So basically, I've been on this like vampire journey for the past maybe 4 years. And how I see it is these beings that have accompanied me in my trajectory as I've come to the US. And so I see the vampire as like this being that is a guide into my subjectivity through the use of mythology. And so this vampire story that I made along my work has never been for me to share, but has always been like a personal matter to me. But somehow like people have forced me or coerced me into sharing this work. And basically there's 3 aspects of this vampire mythology. One, of a vampire that leaves this earth with the last survivors of the human race into a spaceship that explodes along with the vampire. 2, this vampire that tries to find its soul and its carnal self and pull back to itself. And the 3rd iteration, which is titled "In the Garden of Earthly Delights, I Bend to Paradise," which is a vampire trying to find hope in hopelessness. So first, I'll talk about the genesis of my practice, and then move over to what is this vampire story that I wrote and that I co-made work alongside of it. So I don't know if you know this, if you're done art history or you're a history major, but this idea of the axis mundi, in Mesoamerica, is this idea that the earth, the underworld, and heaven could come together all in one place of contention. So rulers, pyramids, objects could become an axis mundi. So to think about this like place where energy, for me, I'm thinking about my work as energy, or like how does memory play into the work that I'm doing. So much of my practice is collapsing materials and memory all together, collapsing it so much that like at one point there's a tear or there's a break that happens in the work that allows me to sort of navigate all of these 3 points of existence. And so what you'll see in my practice is this constant repetition of the arc, of a portal, of a tear, a wound, a butthole, sort of a place where a portal, a threshold could be a place to enter. And so all of the work has that arc. And if you look at the way that we are biologically engineered, everything in evolution has sort of been the arc. Or, if you see my hands extending like this, there's an arc. If you see my legs, there's an arc. If you have a dog play Twister, you'll see the back, the side, and the front all playing in relation to how it's biologically structured like an arc. So those are like these sort of frameworks that I'm working within my practice, and the way that I'm sort of creating these beings that are sort of these portals that I need a lot of energy to make feel that they're alive. So as it was mentioned before, I'm drawn to the idea of shapeshifters, or what we in Mexico call nahuales. So nahuales are like the witches, the shamans, the vampires that basically can turn into an animal. And so, as it was mentioned before, like this idea that like, what if toxicity were to also enter the body of a mythological being? You know, what if this world is so toxic that even the mythology that we have created to live alongside of us becomes toxic as well? So this transformation leaves these vampire beings inside out. So what you see in the work is not the skin that you see like this, but the inside out, the inner lining um, of, of a skin or of intestines. So this is like an example of that, where the work is an arc and it's inviting, but at the same time there's like this notion of longing, where like the work is trying to like reach for something, or like longing for somebody, but it can't reach to that person, so then it longs back to itself. And so these are like ways in which memory allows me to sort of reach into like other people or other memories of my past. And basically, like how I want to clarify is how I make my work is through silicone. So all of my work is silicone, and all of it is made through my t-shirts that I used to wear. So eventually, like, I'll cut the seams or from the sides, and I'll start smearing silicone, different pigments of silicone onto the t-shirt, and then they sort of become like this pelt that then I sew together with my hands or with a sewing machine. And then I start adding animal parts, and I start adding the detritus that I find anywhere that I go. So this is one example of that. And as you can see, like, these are like different things that I've added, like my aunt's shoe, cow hoof, horn tips, rabbit pelts, and all of it is my t-shirt that I smeared with silicone. And but basically, to get back to the vampire, the reason why I'm like fascinated by that is because they exist in like liminal space. They're both dead and they're both alive. And so how I see them are the way that they can explain this queer immigrant story of that is my subjectivity. And in part, there's the idea that the vampire, that is a foreign creature that comes to the West to bring malaise, to bring disease, to bring rats into this Western world. And so there's that part of it, and then there's the part where it's this idea that Dracula has sold its soul to the devil, and so therefore this being has no soul, and it's less than human. So whatever violence we eradicate on it is fine because it has no soul. So therefore we can harm it in whatever way we want. So in a way, Dracula is dehumanized as it crosses into the West. And so what I'm also interested in is the vampire as like this being of desire. So much of me, wanting to be bit by a vampire, and like the desire to feel that and to know what that feels like. But then there's another side of me that's like, what if I become a vampire? Or, this idea of like immortality, or being beautiful forever, which, as like the gays love their Botox. And so like, there's like something about beauty that's like, there in queerness, or also about the way that we share bodily fluids, and the way that there's fear of sharing bodily fluids through desire, but then still allowing our bodies to feel desire through through knowing that there could be a potential infection. And so there's that aspect of the vampire as this queer being. But when you're othered, when you're put on the outskirts, and this otherness becomes these powers that the vampire has. So whatever, if it can immolate somebody through its mind, or if it can have super strength, it's sort of this form of queerness that like appears in the vampire, that sort of becomes a visual emblem of the way that like I feel in my otherness as a queer person. So these are just some examples of like my favorite like vampires that that I'm interested in. And forgive me if I'm going really fast. I have a lot to say. But this idea of the vampire like living in tandem with me is something that has like helped me deal with like reality. And then sometimes, I don't know what reality is in the way that we now look at things. And so there's my truth, and then there's like the fascist truth that is trying to be portrayed in the world. And that feels like a mythology. And it's funny because like my mythology is now my truth, and now feels more like a truth to me than ever before. So I'm hearkening back into that because of this notion of trying to feel reality in some capacity. But I made this vampire story to explain the way that dystopia is happening in the world. And it wasn't my intention, it was just something that came about. So this vampire sneaks inside of the shoe of a maintenance worker that sneaks into the last spaceship to ever leave Earth. And so when this Earth is no longer viable, there's a spaceship that gets to leave Earth that carries all of the people that can afford to leave Earth, like the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos of the world. And so they're out there to colonize a planet and do to it what has happened to this Earth. And so the people that don't get to leave surreptitiously implant a bomb in that spaceship so that it explodes and this gesture of colonization doesn't happen to another planet. And so the bomb explodes and everybody dies, but because the vampire is immortal, it basically explodes in space, and all of its body parts are disentangled, and along with its soul. So this explosion is so violent that its soul and its body come apart. And in space, it has to find rhythm and hope through that gesture of like coming together. So this is one iteration that I presented at Mocha Cleveland. So it's that explosion and that body either trying to like become undone or come into itself. And so I'll read this snippet. Reaching and reaching for itself in the infinitude of deep space, the vampire slowly adjusts and adapts its body to the temperatures and pressures meant to govern large and celestial bodies. Struggling to ground itself and fighting its yearning to stay the same, it becomes all shapes and forms all at once, billowing and plundering its body back and forth into a single central axis. What survives of its prima materna forms a mucus-like membrane that shields its shredded body. In time, more and more layers of muscle, bone, and skin coagulate around the vampire's new body, connecting its tentacular mass of nerves and blood with remnants of the decimated ship. Like a hermit crab looking for a new shield for protection, the vampire merges with the detritus of the ship. It picks up the subtle and microscopic ripples and tears and latches onto them. On these sites of grafting, globular lumps of tissue rediscover rhythm and hope in the chaos of the vampire's remains, protecting it from the extreme brutality of space and the heat of the nearest suns. So for the ICA San Diego, I presented the same iteration of this installation, but it basically was a much bigger museum, and so I had to work with that space, and I made like more tentacles, and I added more things to that installation, and this is the result of it, but I don't have good pictures of it, but what you see in the orange, it's so that it can harken back into like this idea of like the astronaut wearing that orange suit, and like how, I'm assuming that it's because NASA doesn't want to lose its astronauts in space. So in the same way that I think about people that perform gestures of labor when they're out in the streets, or performing maintenance work. So I mentioned before that this vampire snuck inside of the shoe of this maintenance worker. And so if we think about those who get to leave this earth and how they leave this earth with their agency, then I think about people that perform gestures of labor, brown people that perform these gestures of labor, and how they get to survive with their hands. And so there's this sort of honor that I'm doing with somebody that goes inside of the ship, because that, you know, even spaceships need to be cleaned. And so this person survived before the explosion of the ship, because it got to like clean the spaceship. And so by using these hyper visual materials of cleaning and of being hyper visible, I'm giving the visibility to gestures that feel invisible in our everyday world. But then at the same time, my dad worked the night shift at a factory that was really close to the El Paso border. And so he worked the night shift for 7 years. And so I imagine that all of us perform some vampiric practice. So it's this idea of like to have life is to take life. And so my dad's ultimate sacrifice to us was to work the night shift so that he could feed us as his family. So, you know, also his hours were vampiric. He had to work from 9 p.m. to 7 in the morning. So over the span of 7 years, I watched his body decay. And watching that was, you know, watching as like this capitalistic thing was like eating and sucking away his body. But then, you know, at the same time, my dad worked at a factory that makes cardboard. So he would bring the cardboard from work, and he would, I had these shows in LA, New York, and here he was like making like these boxes for my work, which if you think about it, they're the coffins for my vampires. So they've, in a way, like this vampiric practice is so much also about honoring my father and the way that he's helped me along my career. So all of these things are like things that my dad, when he went to see the show, he was like, oh, mira, like this thing that you stole from my garage, or like, look, this other thing that like you took from me. Oh, I've been looking for that. Like, it's been this like constant reoccurring thing, which is really nice. And it's, you know, like these materials are forms in which we can sort of, they're like cultural signifiers to people that don't have the language of going to a museum or what that means. And so they become gestures of basically like seeing yourself through like this like monotonous object. So the vampire explodes and it tries to find itself again. And as I was saying, the vampire also loses its soul in that explosion. So its body comes back together and it starts like dispersing bloodlets of blood into space to sort of summon or bring forth the soul of the vampire, to sort of lure it in. And it comes together and it sort of becomes this globulous mess. But, you know, in this like becoming, if you can imagine what it must feel like to experience that violence on your body and then have to become something else that's a living, breathing entity that's living off of the energy of the ship. And so imagine if you're out in space and nothing but darkness and the infinitude of space and what that hopelessness can feel like, or this idea that like you still have yet to find a viable planet that you can suck blood from or you can survive from. And so in this hopelessness, the vampire becomes catatonic, and but the body starts releasing blood that survived in the explosion into the body of the vampire. So this blood, so if you can imagine that this vampire has lived for 4,000 years, and all of the blood that it has sucked within those 4,000 years have all of the memory of those people that it sucked. And so it's these memories and these people start sort of to surface, and it's in a way this humanity is bestowed on this vampire because all of the memories of these humans start to rise into this vampire and aid it and give it hope because there's something to take with it in this journey. So there's a part where the vampire remembers that you used to be a priest, and it used to, be a priest when blood sacrifice was required during Aztec times, and it remembers that it would do these sacrifices to give, and again in this understanding that to have life is to take life, but then as this memory sort of comes to play, this vampire remembers the last memory, which is of a truck driver. And this truck driver is cruising, looking for sex in the West. And so it goes into a rest stop and it's cruising, trying to find someone. But instead it finds this vampire. And the vampire lures the truck driver into him. And so what ends up happening is the vampire is behind him, the truck driver, and it bites him from the neck, and it holds him, and the vampire reaches into the truck driver, and it cuts open in between the lungs, and it reaches for its heart, and it starts to touch and pump blood from the heart so that the blood from its body can surface faster into its mouth. So it sort of has to, in the story, in the end of this story, it has to give over and turn the pain of what that feels like into pleasure. And so there's that aspect of turning pain into pleasure, and how we allow other bodies to enter us. So I think about people that can give birth and what kind of pains that you can go through in order for you to hold someone for yourself, and what you have to endure to have somebody on your lap. But then I think about when you allow somebody that you love and you care for, or a friend or anyone, and how our tears are these forms of lubrication that we create in our body, or the way that our physical bodies allow somebody to enter us, and the way that we lubricate our bodies so that somebody can come inside of us, literally and metaphorically. How I also think about is like the membrane, or when we're born inside of membrane, and then when we go along our journey, there's always this plasticity that is a membrane that protects us from, when the pandemic happened, everybody was covered in plastic, and when we make cradles for babies, there are these plastic membranes that we use to protect kids. So as we go along in our journey until death, everything is a membrane of plasticity. And so this idea of turning pain into pleasure is my last iteration, and I'll skip all this. And this is the last iteration of it, of this libaceous lubrication that's allowing these bodies to bend and to break, and both in pain and in pleasure. But do I have more time, or? Okay. What? Okay. So I'll just say the last part, which is about the story that I wrote about the vampire and the truck driver, and then afterwards I'll just open it to questions. The truck driver removes his t-shirt and turns his back to it, his sweatpants and underwear slowly pulled down midway all at once. Behind him, thick legs gyrating back and forth, bringing him in. He can feel the breath on his neck. In between both of them, curls of hair open with sweat as mortal and immortal skin brace each other up and down. And then I'll skip that part. But this is the part where the truck driver has to turn pain into pleasure. Clenching in agony, burning from the inside, arching his back as if getting too close to the sun, as the searing, prickling, and brandishing pain takes over his whole body. Knowing his fate, in his wanting to die, in desperation, the truck driver slowly gives into the tormenting pain. He synchronizes his breath to the fists clenching his heart, to his broken ribcage, and to his flailing skin, pulsating signals of distress to his brain. A rush of adrenaline directs pain to pleasure. Each perforating layer becomes a layer of blazing euphoria, his breath guiding the unbearable hurt, becoming a symphony of frothing ecstasy. The vampire's fist opens to bliss, where everything inside him starts brewing in paradise, his neck flying backwards, wailing from the inside, his hurling body radiating a field of energy, the flame of his being shooting up like an atomic flood of light. The light disperses, breaking and splitting into millions of particles, releasing his last breath that for a split second eclipsed the stars. In the final gesture of transubstantiation, the almost lifeless, flickering and flailing limp body of the truck driver lays on the vampire's shoulder. Soon the night will turn into day, and the sounds of insects will dim, and everything will be quiet except for the vampire snarling and baying, interrupted by the excess gargling blood over its mouth as the truck driver's libacious blood drips down and joins with sweat falling into the ground, one drop at a time. So these are more of the images of this last iteration. As you can see, this is like a bucket of golf balls. And so how I think about golf balls is in relation to like queer abject fecundity, or in the way that queer failure, or in the idea that like we don't fit into like hegemonic structures of, you know, giving birth to somebody in that same way, and how we in failure, or in that failure of that world, that like we can create fecundity in other ways. And so these are like golf balls of fecundity, but again, like they're like gesturing through these buckets that my dad had. And there's so much of like reusing these sports bags, or these animal pelts and silicone. So these are some of the images of that work. And yeah, this is some of the installation. There's more of the work, but there's no time to talk about it all. But these are these bodies that are wailing in pleasure and pain. But that's it. Okay. Yeah, if anybody has questions, or okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for sharing this text with us. I'm interested in your use of text, and I'm wondering how it appears in the gallery, if you're printing it, if it's available. I think I'm interested in your thoughts about how text can sometimes be a distraction for a viewer and sometimes a support for the work. And as I am interested in using text, I'm always thinking about these things. So it's helpful to hear how others are stepping through it.
Well, this is the first time that we actually printed snippets of the text into the installation, because the basically like this vampire story has always existed, in my Google Doc. So this was the first time where like the curator basically chose to put that up front, and so it would be one work and then the vampire story snippets of it. But I think the way that I think about it is like, is the story necessary? But perhaps not, because there's so much rich materiality in the work. But I think the story that's like so heady at times can feel like a respite, or like a point of departure, but also a point of pilgrimage where you start from one point to the other, so that it allowed people to sort of meander into the space and basically understand the materiality that's existing in the work. So I guess my response would be, if does the work need that story, or is that story like for you to be guided by it, or like is it necessary to like put that there? And it was mentioned before, like this idea of like, because also like my title descriptions are really long, and I think sometimes the work can feel really alien, or like where it has no point of entry. And so the title sort of becomes a way that people are allowed to see themselves in the work. So there's pop culture descriptions that like rise from the title or from the material, the descriptions that I'm talking about, so that it can put the work in present, or that like people know that the work is existing in this time.
Thank you so much for your talk. We've sort of had this conversation a few times this year about sometimes this like lore or this storytelling aspect of the practice, like it's hard to get from that to an object, and sometimes things are sort of like lost along the way. It does seem like the way that you present the work right now in a talk format, where there's this opportunity to have dialogue and sort of opportunity to present the idea ahead of the work, is like a way of creating a mythology. And it's like unpacking this aspect of your human identity. So I just wondered if you could sort of talk more about what this experience of being able to pack the text that you provided, to join these two elements of your practice, writing and object making. Like, what has that done for you?
I mean, it's been more stressful, you know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, there's like, okay, make the solo show, but then it's like, oh, the story. So it's like, writing the story as I'm like heading to install, or like feeling really raw about the writing aspect of it, because that's like my most vulnerable part, or the part that I can sort of feel like, ill, like what? So I think that's there, but then at the same time, I think I've allowed myself to hide behind the storytelling, because the mythology of it is like my truth. But then there's no like me telling you the truth. And so I'm like, I'm allowed to sort of hide myself in these truths that can feel at times too painful or too violent. And I think that's like my form of like shelling behind these mythologies. And this is no shade to Cranbrook, but like I think a lot of the times institutions want brown people to explain their traumas, so that these institutions can sort of feel eradicated by these gestures of bringing these people to talk about these traumas. And I think sometimes it's better to sort of allow myself some kind of shielding behind how I talk about my practice, or how I talk about other people's experience that relates to my work.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk, Ruben.
Yes.
I don't have a well-formulated question, but I do want to ask you about, I keep thinking of like Francis Bacon in terms of pleasure, pain. And one of the things that I think is really, I'm trying to get a handle on in your work, and I thought you might be able to talk to, is the work seems like it's in this place of between, it's like caught in this almost moment of like a, it's just caught. It's caught in between. And like I think about with like a Francis Bacon or something where you're caught in the moment of the energy or the trauma or something. And there's something that's almost like serene or something about these. Okay, you know what I'm talking about? So I'm just curious about if you could talk about that.
Well, I mean, this piece in particular, it's called Peter from Hereditary, and then it has this like long-winded title that I thought I had put there. But this one specifically harkens back to Francis Bacon, his famous triptych. The triptych of, it's long, also has a long title. But if you can see the bottom tentacle that looks like a worm has these like nails that are like going in a spiral shape. So they're like the mouth of this being. So it's referencing the Francis Bacon where like it has like a being that's baying, and that it's like sitting on a stool, and it's sort of has like this like phallic neck that's like reaching out with its teeth. But I think what sort of you're getting at is that there's a place that is both horror and beauty, or like the ethereal or the carnal that's like happening at the same time, both in the way that like the work is installed both on the ground and then it's installed in space. So it almost feels like the work is about to prance, or it feels like it's in complete serenity with itself. So I do want to, I always play along those like narratives of this way of like inviting, but also are you willing to step into the environment of this being? And so it sort of is like a place, it's sort of an invitation, but also a place where you have to be cautious about how you enter the world of these beings that are made in these spaces.
Thank you for your explanations and everything. Love your work. There's so much going on, and I love it all. Simply, the couples, I don't know where the slide was. Most everything is more on this organic shape, and then you have, at the end of your series, you show some rectangles, some canvases on the wall. Right. And so that's a big departure that I'm curious about.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. So it's part of my painting era. So, I mean, this is like the sculpture department, so I'm sure you know this, or like you've been told that like you're not gonna really sell much. So, so these are like my sad attempts at trying to be a painter, not because I want to, but because, you know, I want it to be commercial. But that hasn't been the case. But if I want to like conceptualize these paintings, these are like just like the skins that I'm stretching. So this is like the fabric that is my work. And so when I've installed these, it's almost like these orange little like worm-like tentacles. It's as if they were out. It's almost like the vampire. You could see it from a spaceship, and you could look out and sort of see it out in space, transforming and becoming something else. So in a way, like, you're inside of the spaceship, but you're looking back in time, looking at the spaceship becoming itself. But it's titled, "Hey You Who Gathers the Stars, Hey You Who Sliced the Moon Open, I've Come to Be Undone." So it's this idea of like this complete obliteration of the body trying to become something else. But what's really interesting is like, this is fabric, and so it's almost like bending the fabric of space and time because of the way that like these works are playing with these conceptual ideas about space. But yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I was really curious. You mentioned earlier on in the lecture putting an element of your own body and your own past into the work through the use of your shirts. And I was curious, with that element of you in the sculptural forms, do you see yourself kind of as almost a shapeshifter in your own right, or as a self-insert in the stories that you create?
I think so. I think my work is hyper-labored, so much time goes into what I'm making, and so I think there's a self-sacrifice that I understand in what I'm doing. But then, sometimes I prick myself when I'm sewing these things, and by default, blood will smear into the work. So in a way, I'm like giving my literal blood to these vampires. So I'm sort of, haphazardly there with the work. But so much also about like my lived experience, like is the narrative that's unfolding in the work. But sometimes, I live in the mundane a lot, and I don't really drink, I don't party, I don't do all these like things that that you should be doing. But, and so for me, like when I do these things that are really meditative, like sewing, they become gestures of glorifying my everyday. And yeah, like I think that subjectivity is like so present, especially in the title descriptions and the story. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. You mentioned narrative just now, and I understand the personal narrative, but I guess I'm interested in, and you mentioned the Axis Mundi and the arc, and I think that that's a lot of fun. But I'm wondering what your relationship is to the narrative arc, like the idea of a story beginning and ending. How do these objects function within this idea that there's a start and a finish, Right. Is there a start and a finish? I don't know.
There's no start and finish. I think that's just how it's sort of, because the story is, I've sort of rewritten it like maybe 500 times, like I'm not joking. And so it's sort of been this thing that I've been writing along the making of my work, but it's never been my intention to make volume 1, volume 2, and volume 3. So that's been interesting just to see what that has become in my practice. But looking forward into the future, I don't have a narrative, so I don't know what my practice will look like without a narrative. And perhaps it would be just more like, this is that, and he's playing with that. But it's become something that I didn't expect that would happen. Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me? No, yeah, I can hear you.
We talked a little bit about this before the lecture, but we talked about the role of assemblage.
Uh-huh.
Wondering how you're responding to pieces of language, pieces of different materials, especially materials that seem to have such a narrative and mundane or personal connection to yourself, and how this assemblage or how these things respond to each other basically, or what unfolds into the next thing, considering how it's also integrated to really strong narrative components for you.
It kind of took me a while to sort of be affirming of what that is, but I think about it a lot of how we alchemy and the way that we transform material, and so it sort of feels like a little witchy, and it feels like I'm spell making with the way that I'm gathering and summoning through language. And so what I'm trying to summon is this being, and again, this being that feels like pretentiousness of trying to make something that feels like it's alive is something that I want to constantly play with. So for something to be alive, it requires energy, and it requires this sort of folding and bending. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, is create so much energy into one point of contention that there is something that is alive and breathing on its own, without like my need of it sort of being fed, that it can feed itself from these mementos or my like lived experience, and the way that like I'm again like glorifying like my everyday through these objects, but also like understanding that like these objects that can feel really heavy, like, you know, car parts, and the hauntology of what that is, and like knowing that like there's a violent gesture that happened, or like my conscious, because my mom is always like, you know, you don't sell because you always put the hoof and you always use like the pelts, and these are like conscious ways that I'm sort of conceptually thinking about my practice as a necessity to like make things feel like they're alive, or that they're full of you know, these things that are like these mythologies that not only carry me but carry other people's experience. But at the same time, like I think again, like going back to like object making, there's a place of imagination that's like really supple in terms of how much I allow these materials to exist in the way that you can sort of imagine that like what you live with every day can sort of become something. So I think these are ways that I'm also like imagining that can be potentialities for like other forms of existing or like world building, is through this sort of material that feels like it can be tossed away or that's obsolete.
Thank you so much for your talk. So we've talked about how there was not narrative, perhaps, in what's here, that you're refusing narrative with beginning, middle, and end. So then I'm interested in the language that you had. There was a lot of assonance that was happening in this scene where intense violence is there alongside pleasure. And I'm wondering about what forms you've found for the language, and if they have any mirror to this like access mundi or to the arch that you kind of, the bend that you showed us at the start.
Okay. So, pardon. So this is this god called Sipetotec, and what it basically is this ritual that the Aztecs and many people in Mesoamerica would have, and it was to honor corn harvesting. Oh wait, Jay, slideshow. Share? All right, okay, got it. So, you know, in terms of like, basically it was this god that was like, that was revered in terms of like the harvest of corn. So there's mixed stemilization, which is how we make corn tortillas. And when you digest corn, you obviously can see that you can't digest it. So there's this like thin membrane layer that like Aztec people figured out to remove. And basically what they did is, it's this idea of removing the skin of something. So they would do this ritual where they would gather the strongest, the fiercest of warriors, and whoever was the strongest would give his body over to this priest, and this priest would flay him and flay his skin, and the priest would put it on himself in honor of the sacrifice that this warrior did, in the same sort of way that like this corn was being harvested and removed. So I've been thinking about that kind of like violence, or like again, like what is energy and what we give to produce life. And so, you know, like there's this like raw opening with this like hide that has like this silicone that mimics the innards of a body. But then there's this like really violent act, but then at the same time, there's this like rawness, like this openness, but there's this like, there's this sort of tentacle that's made out of socks, and it's sort of a way to protect like what is violence on a body, and it's sort of mimicking that sort of idea of like ultimate pleasure or ultimate form of pain, to then sort of be raw about it, but then exposed and then protected, like all at the same time. Yeah. And these are like more of these kind of works about like Sipetotec, but yeah. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey from your MFA
Uh-huh.
to finding your work in museums, et cetera? How, just share what you can.
Sure. My background as an MFA student, I basically started working with Rafa Esparza, who he makes like Adobe work, and so I was his assistant, and I was like living in El Paso. I was really alone. I just didn't know what to do with my life. I had this like desire for like something, and I was going out in the desert by like New Mexico, like taking nudes of myself, and it was like my way of like sort of, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin and feeling the desert sand on my body. And so Rafa saw my work on Instagram, and I wasn't even posting these nudes anywhere else. It was just like me online on Instagram, and then he was like, well, he seems to work out. He could be a good assistant. So we made like 3,000 Adobes for Ballroom Marfa. And what Rafa does is like he'll have like this project, but then he invites other artists over, and he invited Beatriz Cortez and Timo Fowler and other people and Maria Maya. And so because I saw them and they were people of color that looked like me, I was like, well, if they can do it, why not me? So I was super naive about like this art making and like about what it means to be a professional artist, because I was very inspired by what they were doing. And so I had like one semester left as a undergrad, and I took sculpture 1, and then every week or every like month the teacher would say, oh, like the theme is the body or the theme is land. And so I would use those works to apply to all of the schools that were recommended to me for sculpture, and then I got into sculpture. And then just like some this Allegra Viola from Sargent's Daughter, her husband has family in Richmond, so she just went over to my studio and saw my work, and she offered me a show, and then things kind of just like escalated from that. But I know that all of you are students and you're art makers, and I bow down to you in that way. But just know that like it's been a really tough journey. Like it's not easy. Like nothing is guaranteed, and like like you may be like I can talk in terms of personal experience, but like I did this show and then I went back to Mexico City like with nothing, like no money. And so like just know that like whatever you do after this, like it's all up to you, and it depends like what you want to do with it, because nothing is promised in the way that like a career as a dentist or like a career as like whatever else except for art like is promised. So just know that like give yourself grace for like wherever you end up in, because it's a really difficult thing and you're competing with like hundreds of people. So it just depends on how much you're like willing to sacrifice for your practice. How many times are you willing to like live in a couch or like go back to your parents, or like be like a nomad throughout the United States? It just depends on like how much are you willing to like give to your work. And I also remember that like everything is like an opportunity for you to like represent yourself and like show your work. So like always like put your best foot forward, and and making connections like is like really something that like is a really strong thing. And last thing I want to say is like if you think that you're not going to get the grant, like apply anyways, because it sort of allows you to have muscle memory about like how to apply to these things. And, you know, like eventually you'll have like 20 rejections and then 1 yes, but then you have 20 revisions and edits about this thing that you're trying to get at. So just know that like that can be really, really helpful in terms of like how you're like learning language and putting language into your work. That can sometimes feel like, you know, can feel like a hopeless thing because there's so many people applying to the same thing, especially now. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.